A stolen statue killed Troy, and the wooden horse you were taught to remember was only the box it came in. Here is the whole war up to this point, in 4 sentences. Around 1200 BC, Troy stood on the Aegean coast of what is now Turkey, walled and rich, and planted above the one narrow strait every trading ship between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to pass. A Trojan prince named Paris took Helen, the wife of a Spartan king, home with him, and every king who had courted her was already sworn to get her back, so somewhere near 100,000 Greeks sat down outside those walls and stayed for 10 years. By the point this picks up, Hector, the man holding Troy together, is dead. Achilles, the best fighter in Greece, is dead, and the wall has not moved a stone. 10 years, 100,000 men, and nothing. So what actually opens a city like that? Not courage. It was a checklist. 3 things the Greeks had to go and get before Troy was allowed to fall, and not one of them is the thing you were taught. Calchas, the army's seer, announces the first item. Troy cannot fall until Philoctetes rejoins the army. Philoctetes was the archer the Greeks had dumped on the island of Lemnos 10 years earlier because of a snakebite that would not heal and would not stop stinking. And he had been carrying the Bow of Heracles, the strongest hero of the previous generation, its tips wrought out of horn. So the Greek command had to sail back to the island and ask the man they had abandoned there for the loan of his weapon. Would you have handed it over? Second item, and this is the one that matters. The Greeks capture a Trojan prince named Helenus, a seer like his sister, and he tells them the exact condition under which his own city can be killed. Inside Troy stands the Palladium, a statue of Athena, and while that statue stands there, the city cannot be taken. So Diomedes, king of Argos, and one other man go over the wall at night and steal a goddess out of her own temple. The Roman poet Virgil, who wrote his version 700 years after Homer to give Rome a Trojan ancestry, says the image sweated brine when they laid hands on it. Third item, and the coldest of the 3. Fetch Achilles' son. He is a boy on the island of Scyros who has never seen the war. They sail out, put his dead father's armor on him, and bring him back to finish the job. A bow, a statue, and a child. Where is the heroism in that list? And with all 3 of them in hand, the wall was still standing. So how do you take a city? 10 years of war could not. You don't. You leave. On the idea of a king named Odysseus, the Greeks burned their camp, sailed out of sight, and left one enormous wooden horse on the sand. The Trojans dragged it through their own gates themselves. And that name closes a circle most people never notice. The oath that dragged every king in Greece to that beach, the one that turned a runaway wife into a 10-year war, was not Helen's father's idea. It was invented by one of her suitors, a man from a small rocky island called Ithaca, who had turned up with no gifts and no real chance, and traded the idea away in exchange for help marrying somebody else. Same man. He designed the trap that started the war and the trap that ended it, and he spent the 10 years in between fighting a war he had engineered and never wanted. But why did the horse work? A hollow wooden animal standing alone on an empty beach should have been burned where it sat. The old sources say the Greeks left one man behind to explain it. Sinon lets himself be captured and tells the Trojans exactly what they want to hear. The horse is an offering to Athena, built on the seer's advice, to buy off the anger of the goddess, whose statue the Greeks had just stolen out of her temple. There it is. That is the con, and it is far better than a wooden box full of soldiers. The burglary was never only a box ticked on a prophecy. It was the cover story. Burn this horse, and you insult the goddess whose protection you have only just lost. Would you strike the match? so they do not burn it. Both surviving accounts of that night say the Trojans broke down part of their own city wall to get it through, because it would not fit the gate. A priest called Laocoon throws a spear into its flank, hears the hollow boom come back, and tells them not to trust the gift. The moment that became the phrase about Greeks bearing gifts, 2,000 years before anybody printed it on a poster. Sea serpents kill him and both his sons in front of the crowd. Cassandra, the Trojan king's daughter, screams that the city is already full of fire and blood. They laugh at her. It had taken the carpenter Epeius 3 days to build the thing, and the oldest surviving list of the men waiting inside it names about 30. And Homer keeps one moment from inside that horse that almost undid the entire war. Helen, the woman the whole thing was fought over, back inside Troy after 9 years, walks around the horse in the dark and calls the hidden men by name, one at a time, in the voices of their own wives. Men who had not heard those voices in 10 years. One of them opens his mouth to answer, and Odysseus clamps a hand over it and holds it shut. Whose side was Helen on that night? Homer never says, and people have been arguing about it for 28 centuries. Then Sinon lifts a torch. The fleet comes back from behind the island it had been hiding behind. The men climb down, and Troy stops being a city. The sack is where the ancient sources stop agreeing with each other, and it is worth watching them disagree. Priam, the old king, dies at an altar inside his own house. In Quintus of Smyrna, a Greek poet writing roughly 1100 years after Homer, Achilles' son takes his gray head off with a single stroke. In Virgil, the same young man drags him to that altar by the hair, through the blood of a son who has just been killed in front of him, and drives a sword into his chest. 2 authors describing the same 30 seconds, and they do not match. Which one is the record? Neither. Nobody was writing any of it down at the time. This is a story that was retold out loud for 1,000 years, and if you read the sources side by side, you can watch it change shape. What they do agree on is worse. Hector's baby son is thrown from the wall. Cassandra is dragged out of Athena's temple. And the men who did those 2 things were about to learn that the gods had been keeping a ledger. Because here is the ending nobody teaches. The Greeks won, and winning destroyed them. Why would the gods punish the side that won? The Odyssey, which most people remember as a monster story, is really the last chapter of this war, and in its 4th book, it audits the entire fleet. Agamemnon, the high king who commanded 1,000 ships, gets home to Mycenae safely, and is butchered at his own welcome feast by the cousin who had spent those 10 years in his palace. Homer has him say it himself, from the land of the dead, killed like a fat beast in a slaughterhouse. His wife had been waiting since the day he put their daughter on an altar to buy a favorable wind, and she had had 10 years to plan the reply. The man who dragged Cassandra out of the temple is shipwrecked, survives on a bare rock, boasts that the sea could not kill him, and is drowned the moment the god splits the rock underneath him. Menelaus, whose missing wife started all of it, is blown off course and spends 8 years drifting through Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, and Libya before he sees Sparta again. Nestor, the oldest man in the army, sails straight home and loses nobody at all. And Odysseus loses every man he brought. 10 years to take the city, 10 more to get home, and he walks into his own hall alone. The cleverest man in Greece built himself a 20-year sentence out of one good idea. So, is any of it real? For most of the last 3,000 years, educated opinion said no. Then, in 1864, a British consular official named Frank Calvert bought part of a mound in northwest Turkey called Hisarlik, cut trial trenches into it, and became convinced he was standing on Troy. In 1871, Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman with money, certainty, and no patience, began digging there in earnest and drove a trench straight down through the layers he was actually looking for, destroying much of the Bronze Age city on his way to an older, deeper one he wrongly believed was Homer's. So which layer is Homer's? There is not one Troy at Hisarlik. There are 9 stacked on top of each other. In the 1930s, the American archaeologist Carl Blegan sorted those 9 layers into 46 sublevels, and in one of them, the layer called Troy 7A, he found ash up to a meter thick, charred timbers, bronze arrowheads embedded in the walls, and human skeletons lying unburied in the streets. That layer burned around 1180 BC. From 1988 to 2005, Manfred Korfmann of Tübingen went back with modern equipment and found that everyone before him had been excavating the castle and missing the town. Beyond the fortress walls lay a lower city, far bigger than Schliemann ever imagined, with heaps of slingstones piled near the palace. He also established something the poems never mention. The layer underneath, Troy 6H, had been wrecked by an earthquake, while Troy 7A was wrecked by people. And there is a paper trail. In 1924, the Swiss scholar Emil Forer, reading Hittite tablets from central Anatolia, proposed that a city the Hittites called Wilusa was Ilios, Troy, and that a people they called Ahiawa were the Achaeans, which is Homer's own word for the Greeks. One tablet records a treaty, around 1280 BC, between the Hittite king Muatali II and a king of Wilusa named Alexandru. Alexandru is what a Greek would have said as Alexandros, and Alexandros is the other name Homer gives Paris. Among the gods called on to guarantee that treaty is one written Apollonius, which most scholars read as Apollo. So, is that Homer's Paris, putting his name to a treaty with a Hittite king? Be careful here, because this is the exact point where the internet overclaims. None of that is the Trojan War. The historian Trevor Bryce's caution is the one to keep. The Hittite evidence does not demonstrate an actual war at Troy, and the material is soft enough to be bent into almost any shape you want. What the ground does establish is smaller and stranger and stands up. There was a real, rich, fortified city, precisely where the poem puts one. It controlled that strait. Greeks and Hittites really did quarrel over it, and one version of that city died violently in fire at the end of the Bronze Age. The archaeologists give you a decade, the poets gave you a night. Greek chroniclers fixed the date of that night, 1184 BC. A city that had survived 10 years burned in a single one, and every domino traces back to one uninvited guest and a piece of golden fruit.